At an auction, the highest bid wins. That's just how it works, right? Well, what if I told you that's not always true? In the intense world of high-stakes bidding, the person with the most cash doesn't always get to take home the prize. Today, we're going to dig into why.
So picture this, you're at an auction, your heart's pounding, you've just made the highest bid on something you've wanted for ages. But then the auctioneer's gavel comes down and sells it to somebody else. You'd be fuming, right? You'd feel totally cheated. But is what they did actually illegal? Well, the answer is a whole lot more complicated than you might think.
To really get our heads around how this can even happen, we need to start with a basic legal rule. And this rule applies to pretty much everything, from buying a carton of milk to bidding on a priceless piece of art. It's a concept called an invitation to treat. Now, that sounds a bit stuffy, I know, but think of it this way. When you walk into a supermarket and see stuff on the shelves, the store isn't making you an offer to sell. It's actually inviting you to make them an offer. You do that by taking your items up to the checkout. The contract is only formed when the cashier accepts your money. It's basically just an invitation to start a negotiation.
And it's the same deal at an auction. The auctioneer up there calling for bids, that's just the invitation. Your bid, that's the actual offer. And this difference is absolutely crucial. See, an invitation isn't legally binding, but your offer is what can be accepted to actually seal the deal.
So the standard flow is pretty simple. Until that gavel smacks the table, there is no contract. This goes all the way back to an old case called Payne versus Cave. And it means that before that final bang, you can take back your bid and, this is the important part, the auctioneer can reject it. So in a regular auction, the seller is the one holding all the cards.
But the entire game changes when the auctioneer says two little magic words. And that's when a whole new layer of complexity gets thrown into the mix.
Without reserve. You've definitely heard this before. It gets everyone in the room excited, right? Makes you think you might be about to snag an incredible bargain. But in legal terms, it's so much more than just clever jargon. It's a very specific and very powerful promise that's being made to every single person in that room.
So what's the promise? Well, advertising an auction without reserve is basically the auctioneer pledging that the item will be sold to the highest genuine bidder. No takebacks, no secret minimum price, and, this is key, the owner isn't allowed to bid on their own stuff just to pump up the price. It's a promise of a fair fight to the finish.
So this brings us to the obvious question, doesn't it? If there's a clear promise to sell to the highest bidder, then that bidder has to win. Case closed, right? Well, this is where it gets really fascinating because the answer depends entirely on where in the world you happen to be.
And now we enter a legal showdown. It's a tale of two courts, the United Kingdom versus Australia. They both looked at the power of that without reserve promise and came to completely different conclusions. Let's kick things off with the English position.
Our story starts way back in 1859 with a case called Warlow v. Harrison. It was all about a public auction for a horse, and the advertisement for it was crystal clear. The sale was without reserve. So the plaintiff, a guy named Mr. Warlow, was the highest genuine bidder in the room. He put down 60 guineas. But then, just as the gavel was about to fall, the horse's own owner put in a bid for 61 guineas, and the auctioneer just knocked the hammer down and sold the horse right back to him, completely ignoring Mr. Warlow. As you can imagine, Warlow was furious, arguing that the without reserve promise had been broken, so he sued.
Now, the English court solution here was just brilliant. They came up with this idea of a collateral contract. What that means is, by advertising the auction without reserve, the auctioneer creates a second, totally separate promise to all the bidders. It's a promise to play by the rules. So by letting the owner bid, the auctioneer broke that second promise. And that meant Mr. Warlow, as the highest genuine bidder, had every right to sue for damages. And don't think this is just some dusty old rule from the 1800s. It was confirmed as recently as the year 2000 in a case called Berry v. Davies. In that one, an auctioneer refused a bid of just £200 for some machines that were actually worth almost £28,000. He refused just because he thought the bid was too low, even though the auction was without reserve. The court basically said, nope, a promise is a promise, and they awarded the bidder thousands of pounds in damages. Okay, now let's hop on a plane and fly down to Australia, where the courts looked at a really similar situation and came to a completely different conclusion.
In the 1977 case AGC v. McWhorter, a property auction became without reserve partway through, but the seller still refused the highest bid. The Australian court's ruling was blunt. The phrase without reserve changes nothing. An auction is always an invitation to treat, and the seller can always just say no.
The difference here is just night and day. In the UK, saying without reserve creates that binding side deal, that collateral contract, and it puts the auctioneer on the hook. But in Australia, nope. Legally, those words are basically just hot air. It's still just an invitation, and the bidder has no real rights if the seller gets cold feet. The exact same facts lead to a totally different outcome.
So after that little legal world tour, what's the bottom line? If you find yourself at an auction with a paddle in your hand, what should you take away from all this?
Okay, so let's recap what we've learned. First, in any standard auction, your bid is just an offer, and it can be rejected. No hard feelings. Second, that phrase without reserve is a promise. But here's the kicker. Whether that promise is legally enforceable depends entirely on where you are. In the UK, it is, and you can sue the auctioneer if they break it. In Australia, it isn't, and the seller can still walk away. It's a really powerful reminder that in the world of law, geography can be destiny.
And that really leaves us with a final, much bigger question, doesn't it? This whole thing boils down to the power of a promise. What we've seen today is that even when a promise sounds crystal clear, the law might see it differently, depending on the context and, of course, the location. So the next time you hear a promise, you might just find yourself asking, is that a statement of intent, or is that a deal that could actually be enforced in a court of law? The answer, as we've seen, is rarely that simple.